Mrs. Hayes, you signed everything away, the lawyer said, sliding the document across the table as my daughter-in-law Vanessa leaned back in her chair, smiling like she'd already won, and my son Daniel wouldn't even look at me. I folded my hands, nodded once, and said nothing, because that's exactly what they expected from a grieving widow. Quiet, confused, easy to push aside. But what they didn't know was that 48 hours earlier, in the same kitchen where Vanessa now walked around like she owned the place, she had asked me a simple question. You remember signing the transfer papers, right? And something in her tone told me everything I needed to know. So I made one phone call, met one person who still respected my name, and I let them believe I was blind while I watched every move they made. Now, in that room, with their future already mapped out in their heads, I finally reached into my bag and placed a second document on the table, identical at first glance, but not the one they thought existed. And I looked at Vanessa as her smile began to crack and said, very calmly, "This is what I actually signed." I did not sign that paper because I was confused. I did not hesitate because I was afraid. And I certainly was not silent because I had nothing to say. I was silent because 48 hours earlier, in the quiet kitchen of the house I had lived in for over 30 years, something small had shifted in a way that could not be undone. That morning had started like all the others since my husband passed, slow, deliberate, filled with the kind of stillness that does not comfort but settles around you like a weight you learn to carry. I had poured my coffee into the same white mug he used every day, the one with the faint crack along the handle, and I stood by the window watching the sunlight stretch across the backyard, measuring time not in minutes but in memories, when I heard Vanessa's heels on the hardwood floor behind me, steady, confident, not hesitant the way they used to be when she first came into this house. "You are up early," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful, and I turned slightly, offering a small nod, studying her the way one studies a detail that feels out of place but cannot yet be explained. She moved toward the counter as if she belonged there, reaching for a glass, opening cabinets without asking, small things that might have seemed harmless if they had not begun to happen so often. "Daniel mentioned you might want to organize some of the paperwork," she continued, her tone casual, as if this were a suggestion made out of care rather than convenience. And I watched her carefully, the way her fingers traced the edge of the counter, the way she avoided looking directly at me, and then she asked the question, the one that changed everything. "You remember signing the transfer forms, right? Just to simplify things?" She said it lightly, almost as an afterthought, but there was something beneath it, something too precise to be accidental, and I did not answer immediately. I took a sip of my coffee instead, letting the silence stretch just long enough to see how she would react, and when I finally looked at her, she smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Which forms?" I asked quietly, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, her expression faltered before settling back into place. "Oh, just the standard documents Daniel mentioned, nothing complicated," she replied, too quickly, too smoothly, and that was when I felt it. Not panic, not fear, but clarity, the kind that arrives without warning and leaves no room for doubt, because I had signed documents before, important ones my husband had insisted we review together, line by line, never rushed, never assumed, and I knew I had not signed anything recently without understanding it. Later that morning, after Vanessa left the room and the house fell quiet again, I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one where we kept our records, and I opened the drawer slowly, carefully, as if the act itself required intention. I began to go through the files, each folder labeled in my husband's handwriting, each document placed with care, and at first everything appeared normal, familiar, unchanged, until it did not, until I noticed a page that did not quite align with the rest, a signature that looked like mine but felt wrong in a way I could not immediately explain, and I sat there for a long time, the paper in my hands, not reacting, not rushing, simply observing, because there is a difference between seeing something and understanding it, and I needed to be certain which one this was. I closed the folder gently, placed it back exactly where I had found it, and reached for my phone, not with urgency, but with purpose, because if there is one thing I learned from my husband, it is that when something feels wrong, you do not confront it immediately, you confirm it quietly, and that was the moment everything began to change. Not in that office with the lawyer, not when the words were spoken across the table, but here, in this quiet house, with a single question that was never meant to be questioned. I did not call Daniel, and I did not confront Vanessa, because the truth is, when something begins to unravel quietly, the worst thing you can do is pull on the thread too quickly. So instead, I called someone who had nothing to gain from lying to me. Someone who had known my husband long before Vanessa ever stepped into our lives. Someone who still used my name with the same respect he always had. His name was Robert Keller, and he had managed our accounts for over 20 years, the kind of man who did not speak in guesses, only in facts. And when he answered the phone, there was a brief pause after I introduced myself, not out of hesitation, but recognition. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "I was sorry to hear about your husband." And I thanked him, keeping my tone steady, because this was not a call about grief. Not really. This was a call about something that did not yet have a name. I asked him a simple question, the kind that sounds ordinary on the surface. "Have there been any recent changes to my accounts or property documents?" And there was another pause, longer this time, and I could almost hear him considering how to answer, not whether to tell me the truth, but how much of it I was ready to hear. "There have been some requests," he said carefully, "initiated within the last few weeks," and I felt something settle inside me. Not fear, not surprise, but confirmation, the quiet kind that replaces uncertainty with direction. "What kind of requests?" I asked, and he explained, slowly, clearly, that there had been inquiries about transferring certain assets, about consolidating ownership, about simplifying structures that had been in place for decades, and every word he used echoed something Vanessa had said in that kitchen, the same language, the same tone, the same intention dressed as efficiency, and I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to listen more carefully, because when two separate conversations begin to sound the same, it is no longer coincidence. "Were these changes completed?" I asked, and this time his answer came without hesitation. "Not fully," he said. "Some documents were submitted, but there were inconsistencies, signatures that required verification, and I held them for review." And that was the moment everything became clear, not in a dramatic way, not with shock or disbelief, but with a calm understanding that settled into place like a piece of a puzzle finally fitting where it belonged. I thanked him, asked him to send me copies of everything, and ended the call without saying more than necessary, because there is a certain power in knowing something that others believe you do not, a quiet advantage that does not need to be announced. Later that afternoon, when the house was silent again and the light had shifted across the living room floor, I sat at the desk and reviewed the documents he sent, one by one, taking my time, comparing dates, signatures, wording, and it did not take long to see it. The subtle alterations, the phrasing that suggested consent where there had been none, the placement of my name in contexts I did not remember agreeing to, and yet it was done carefully, not carelessly, as if whoever prepared it believed they would never be questioned. I did not react, not outwardly. I did not pick up the phone again. I did not confront anyone, because by then I understood something they clearly did not. This was not about a single document, or even a single decision. This was a plan, one that relied entirely on my silence, my grief, and my willingness to trust. And the moment I realized that, I also understood exactly what I needed to do next, not to stop them immediately, but to let them continue just long enough to believe they had already succeeded. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because once you see something clearly, your mind does not let you return to the comfort of not knowing. It begins to replay every moment, every conversation, every small detail that once seemed harmless and now feels deliberate. I lay there in the quiet of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and I began to remember, not in fragments, but in patterns, the way Vanessa had slowly woven herself into decisions that were never hers to make, the way she had started asking questions that sounded helpful but always led toward the same place: paperwork, ownership, control, and I realized that none of it had been sudden. None of it had started after my husband passed. It had simply become easier for her once he was no longer there to notice. I remembered a Sunday afternoon about 3 months earlier, when she had sat at the kitchen table with a stack of documents, smiling politely as she explained that it would be simpler if everything was updated, that it would protect the family if assets were streamlined, and Daniel had stood beside her, nodding, repeating her words as if they were his own, and I had listened, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply observing, because even then something had felt slightly off, not wrong enough to confront, but not right enough to ignore. There had been other moments too, smaller ones, easier to dismiss at the time, like the day she asked where we kept the original property deeds, or the time she suggested changing the access codes to the safe, just in case. Always with a reason that sounded responsible, always framed as concern, and I had allowed it, not out of trust, but out of patience, because I had always believed that people eventually reveal their intentions if you give them enough space. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Daniel had not led any of this. He had followed, not out of malice, but out of convenience, out of the quiet habit of agreeing with the person closest to him. And that realization did not hurt in the way I expected. It did not feel like betrayal. It felt like distance, the kind that grows slowly over time until one day you realize you are no longer standing in the same place. The next morning, I moved through the house the way I always did, making coffee, opening the curtains, placing everything exactly where it belonged. Because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else begins to shift, and when Vanessa walked into the kitchen, she smiled the same way she always did, polite, composed, as if nothing had changed, and in that moment I understood something important. She did not know that I knew, and that was my advantage. "Did you look at those documents we talked about?" she asked casually, reaching for a glass, and I turned toward her, meeting her eyes with the same calm expression I had practiced for years. I glanced at them. I said, my voice even, my tone neutral, and she nodded, satisfied, because that was the answer she expected. That was the version of me she believed she was dealing with. Someone who would not question too deeply, someone who would eventually agree. I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and let the silence settle between us, not awkward, not tense, just present, because silence, I had learned, often says more than words. And as I stood there, watching her move through my kitchen as if it already belonged to her, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I would not stop them yet. I would not confront them or expose what I had discovered, because they were not finished, and if I interrupted too soon, I would only see part of the truth. But if I waited, if I allowed them to continue believing their plan was working, then when the moment came, I would not just understand what they had done, I would be ready for it. I did not need more proof after that morning, but I still watched, because when people believe they are close to winning, they become careless in ways they do not even notice, and that is exactly what happened over the next 2 days. Vanessa became more confident, more direct, no longer circling the subject but stepping into it as if it were already settled. She began leaving documents on the kitchen counter instead of asking me to review them, highlighting sections with a neat yellow marker, placing sticky notes where she wanted my signature, small arrows pointing to blank lines that were waiting for me, and each time I passed by, I would glance at them briefly, just enough to maintain the appearance of interest, never enough to suggest suspicion, because the illusion mattered more than the action. Daniel followed her lead without question, his tone shifting in subtle ways, more assertive than before, less like a son asking and more like someone confirming what had already been decided. "It will make things easier for everyone," he said one afternoon as we stood in the living room, his hands in his pockets, avoiding direct eye contact again, and I nodded slowly, the same way I had in the lawyer's office, offering nothing that could be used against me, nothing that could disrupt the path they believed they were guiding me down. That evening, after they had both gone out, I returned to the desk and reviewed the copies Robert had sent again, this time more carefully, comparing each page to the originals I had kept hidden in a separate folder, one my husband had insisted we maintain for unexpected situations, as he used to call them. And I realized just how precise Vanessa's approach had been. She had not altered everything, only enough to redirect ownership, only enough to create a version of reality that looked legitimate on the surface but shifted control entirely beneath it. And what struck me most was not the boldness of it, but the patience, the way it had been built over time, quietly, without drawing attention. I placed the documents back exactly as I had found them, making sure nothing appeared disturbed, because the smallest detail could raise a question, and questions were the one thing I could not allow yet. The next morning, Vanessa mentioned scheduling a meeting with the lawyer, her tone light, but her eyes watching me carefully, measuring my reaction, and I gave her exactly what she expected, a small nod, a calm acceptance. If that is what needs to be done, I said, and she smiled, satisfied, because in her mind, everything was falling into place exactly as planned. What she did not see, what neither of them saw, was that every step they took brought them closer to a moment they did not control, because while they believed they were leading me toward an ending, I had already begun preparing a different one that did not require confrontation, one that did not depend on raising my voice or exposing them too early, but one that would reveal itself at the precise moment when they were most certain they had already succeeded. And as I stood there in that same kitchen, holding my coffee, watching the two of them move through a life they thought was about to become theirs, I understood something with complete clarity. They were not just underestimating me, they were relying on it. And that would be the very thing that made them lose everything they thought they had already gained. I did not wait for the meeting to prepare, because preparation, real preparation, never happens in a rush. It happens in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when assumptions are still in your favor and the people around you believe they understand exactly who you are. And that is when I began to move, not outwardly, not in any way that would draw attention, but carefully, deliberately, making decisions that would not reveal themselves until the moment I needed them to. The next morning, after Daniel left for work and Vanessa stepped out to run errands, I took the folder my husband had kept hidden for years, the one he used to call our backup truth, and I spread its contents across the dining table, each document placed side by side with the copies Robert had sent me, comparing line by line, signature by signature, until there was no doubt left, not even a fraction, that what they intended to present as final was, in fact, incomplete, altered just enough to shift control, but not enough to withstand scrutiny. I made a decision then, one that felt less like a reaction and more like a continuation of something my husband had already started. I would not refuse to sign, I would not argue, and I would not expose the inconsistency before its time, because refusing would only delay them, and arguing would only alert them. Instead, I would give them exactly what they expected, just not in the way they believed. I contacted a different attorney, one Daniel and Vanessa had never met, someone recommended quietly through Robert, someone who understood discretion more than speed. And when we spoke, I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize what I had discovered. I simply explained the facts, calmly, clearly, and asked a single question. If I allow this to proceed, how do I ensure the truth is still protected? And his answer was simple, almost understated, but it carried the weight I needed. You preserve your originals, and you control when they are revealed. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, when Vanessa returned and asked if I had reviewed the documents again, I nodded, offering the same measured response I had given before, and when she placed a pen in front of me, pointing to the line where my signature would go, I picked it up without hesitation, because hesitation would have been the first sign of resistance, and resistance was not part of the role they expected me to play. I signed where she indicated, slowly, carefully, making sure my hand did not tremble, making sure nothing about that moment suggested anything other than compliance. And when I finished, she smiled, relieved, satisfied, her confidence growing in a way that made her forget to be cautious. Daniel thanked me, his voice softer now, almost grateful, and I looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a quiet understanding that he had chosen his place in something he did not fully see. And I did not correct him, because correction was not my goal. Clarity was, and clarity would come soon enough. That evening, after they both went to bed, I returned to the dining table, gathered the original documents, and placed them back into the folder my husband had trusted me to keep safe, sealing it carefully, not out of fear that it would be taken, but out of certainty that it would be needed. And as I turned off the lights and walked back to my room, I realized that everything they believed had just been finalized was, in truth, only the beginning of something they had not prepared for, because while they thought I had given them control, I had only given them the illusion of it, and illusions, as I had learned, have a way of collapsing at exactly the right moment. The morning of the meeting arrived without announcement, just another quiet shift in the rhythm of the house. But everything about it felt different in a way that did not need to be spoken. Vanessa was already dressed when I came downstairs, her posture straighter, her movements more precise. as if she were preparing for something important, and Daniel stood by the door checking his watch, not impatient exactly, but eager in a way that suggested this day had been waiting for him longer than it had for me. We should not be late, Vanessa said softly, glancing in my direction with that same composed smile, and I nodded, reaching for my coat, moving at the same measured pace I always had, because rushing would have meant reacting, and I had no intention of reacting to anything they believed they controlled. The drive to the office was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that does not invite conversation. Daniel focused on the road, Vanessa occasionally adjusting something on her phone, and I sat in the back seat, watching the passing streets, familiar places that no longer felt connected to the life they thought they were taking from me. And I realized then that what they were trying to claim was not just a house or a set of documents. It was a version of me they believed would accept being replaced. When we arrived, the building stood exactly as it had before: glass, steel, clean lines. Everything about it designed to feel official, permanent, unquestionable. And Vanessa walked ahead of us as if she had already been there many times, greeting the receptionist with confidence, using names I had never heard before, and I followed quietly, observing, noting how easily she moved within a space that was supposed to be unfamiliar, how naturally she carried herself as if this moment belonged to her. The lawyer greeted us with a polite nod, his expression professional, neutral, and he gestured toward the same conference room, the same table, the same arrangement of papers waiting in precise order. And as I took my seat, I placed my hands gently in my lap, the same way I had before, maintaining the same calm presence they had already accepted as truth. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice warm, almost reassuring. "Everything is ready. This will not take long." And Daniel added quietly, "It is just final confirmation." And I looked at him then, really looked at him, not searching for guilt or doubt, but for understanding, and found neither, only a quiet certainty that he believed this was the right thing to do. The lawyer began to speak, explaining the documents, outlining the transfers, confirming the signatures, each word reinforcing the version of events they had constructed, and I listened without interruption, without correction, because this part, this performance, needed to unfold exactly as they expected. It needed to reach its conclusion without resistance, so that when it changed, there would be no question about what had just happened. Vanessa rested her hand lightly on the folder again, that same gesture of ownership, her confidence now fully visible, no longer hidden beneath politeness, and I realized that she was no longer being careful. She believed the outcome was already secured, that there was nothing left to question, nothing left to lose. I allowed a small breath to escape, not a sigh, not a reaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of timing. And as the lawyer finished speaking and looked toward me for confirmation, I felt something settle into place, not tension, not anticipation, but readiness, the kind that comes when every piece has already been set long before the moment arrives. And I knew then that this was exactly where everything was meant to change, not because I would force it to, but because they had unknowingly brought it to the only place where it could no longer hold. The lawyer's final words settled into the room like something meant to close a door. "If everything is in order, we can proceed with confirmation." And he looked directly at me, not unkindly, but with the quiet expectation that I would agree, that I would follow the path already prepared for me. And for a moment, I simply met his gaze, then lowered my eyes to the document in front of me, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers tightening just enough on the edge of the folder to betray a flicker of impatience, and Daniel leaned forward a fraction, as if trying to anticipate my response before I gave it, and I realized then how completely they believed in this moment, how certain they were that everything had already been decided. I placed my hand lightly on the paper, not to sign, not yet, but to anchor the moment, and then I reached into my bag, slowly, without urgency, without hesitation, because timing is not about speed, it is about precision. And when I placed the second folder on the table, there was a subtle shift in the air, not dramatic, not immediate, but noticeable enough that Vanessa's expression changed, just slightly, just enough to reveal that this was not part of the plan she had constructed. "Before we continue," I said, my voice calm, even, carrying no edge, no accusation, just clarity, and I opened the folder, turning it toward the lawyer, not toward Vanessa, not toward Daniel. Because this was not a conversation meant to be argued. It was one meant to be understood. I believe we should review this version as well, I added, and the lawyer leaned forward, his attention sharpening as his eyes moved across the page, comparing, reading, noticing. The silence that followed was different now, no longer empty, no longer comfortable. It held weight. It held questions that had not been asked yet, but were already forming. And Vanessa sat very still, her confidence no longer expanding, but tightening, contained, as if she were trying to hold the moment together by refusing to acknowledge the shift. This appears to be an original draft, the lawyer said. Slowly, his tone measured, and I nodded, not correcting him, not adding more than necessary, because the document itself was doing what I needed it to do. It was speaking without interruption, without emotion, without doubt. Daniel looked from the lawyer to Vanessa, his expression uncertain now, no longer aligned with hers. And for the first time since we had entered the room, he seemed to realize that there was something he did not fully understand, something that had not been explained to him in the same careful way everything else had